This is one of those stories in Scripture that sometimes we think we know the story. We think we know, who the characters were, what happened, why. But very often this is a story that we know because we've read it in kids' picture books. We know the storybook version. We know the story that is portrayed in pastel posters on the nursery wall of an ark and fuzzy animals and Noah and the dove. But this story, arguably more than any, is difficult. It is not warm and fuzzy. It is stark and prickly and complicated. This is a story that is challenging for us. And it is also challenged by people who read it. I think that it's safe to say that there's more debate than average about the story of Noah and the flood than about a lot of the stories in Scripture. We talked briefly last week about the difference between events and parables, that there are different kinds of stories recorded in Scripture. Some things are events. They're historical things that happened to actual people who were born and lived and died on this planet. Some of the stories are parables. Parables are fiction that is created mostly by Jesus, but not exclusively, to teach a particular point, to make a particular lesson understandable for us as we walk with God through the world and through our lives. There's a lot of debate about Noah's Ark. There is scientific debate. There are people for whom this story has implications as they explore whether the earth is billions of years old or whether the earth is thousands of years old. This story, I'm not going to get into the details, but this story has implications for that debate. There is historical debate about this story. If it actually happened, if it was an event, was it like really, literally, the whole earth flooded completely and every creature on the entire planet? Or was it a regional thing when the writer says the whole earth? Is he talking about that region of the world? And there's a lot of debate about, where did the flood happen? How big was the flood? There is theological debate. And for many of us, this is where we land. We ask the question, how could a loving God do what is described in this story? There is mythological debate about this story because there are somewhat similar kinds of myths in other cultures at the time that describe floods and big boats and people being saved and people perishing. So there are comparisons between those mythological floods and Noah's flood, and people say, well, aren't we basically just talking about the same story but imported from one culture to another? So there's this mythological debate. There's the logistical debate, and my family got into this a little bit this week. The logistical debate of, okay, well, what did they do with all the manure? Like, seriously, you're in this boat. It doesn't have much in the way of windows. It's got one door, and that's closed from the outside. What did they do with all the manure? And then, what about the penguins? Like, how did the penguins get from Antarctica to basically Iraq? And how they can't fly. So, there are logistical questions that people ask and say, well, how did that work? How did that even happen? These are all questions that arise from the story of Noah, and there's a lot of that kind of conversation. And I'm not going to address any of those questions. You guys can do that research yourselves, and you can figure that stuff out for yourselves. What is not a question, what there is no doubt about, is that this story is in Scripture. That throughout all of the generations and all of the history of Jewish thought, Jewish tradition, Christian thought, Christian tradition, this story has been accepted as part of our Scripture. That this story is important, it carries weight for us, it means something, it's there for a reason. And when we ask the question, did it happen or did it not happen? It's kind of beside the point. And we're gonna get there in the end. Whether it's an event or whether it's a parable is not relevant to what we're going to talk about this morning. That's definitely something that is good to work that through for yourself, to get a good understanding of history and parable and understanding. I mean, personally, I believe that it happened. Something happened. Exactly what it looked like, we don't know, but something happened historically. So you don't need to worry that, I'm going all, liberal woo-woo on you. I do believe that it happened. But that's something that we each need to work out for ourselves. And we also need to work out for ourselves the difference between events and parables. And if someone decides that the story is, in their understanding, a parable, then you need to figure out, what does that mean? Because parables carry weight. Parables are not just stories that we tell each other for amusement and entertainment. Parables mean something. So we're going to get there in the end to talk about how those pieces fit together. So we're going to start with some statistics. Noah and the Ark statistics, okay? You can answer these questions if you know the answer. How many people were in the Ark? 8? Yep, 8. Noah, his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. And he had 3 sons, so there were 8 people. How many animals were in the ark? More than 8. A lot. Yeah, so there were 2 of what were called, one pair each of what were called unclean animals, and 7 pairs of what were called clean animals, and 7 pairs of birds. So we're talking about a lot of animals. This is very specific. And it's interesting to ask yourself the question about clean animals and unclean animals. We don't know, exactly how those were defined in Noah's day, because this was before the law that God gave to the people of Israel through Moses, which defined, clean and unclean animals for those people. So we don't actually know, how they defined that, what that breakdown looked like. But yeah, so 2 each of unclean animals, 7 pairs each of clean animals, 7 pairs of birds. Yeah, so lots and lots of animals. How many days were they in the ark? Just over a year. Yeah, it's amazing when I think about that. And you have that 40 number in your mind because that's how many days it rained. And the number 40 appears a couple of times in the story, and we're going to come back to that as well. But they were in there for just over a year. So I sort of termed this in terms of our calendar when you read the story through. So this is the 600th year of Noah's life. So sort of on the 17th of February, the flood began. That's when it started to rain. The 17th of July, the ark landed on the top of the mountains of Ararat. On the 1st of October, the mountaintops had become visible. On the 1st of January of the next year, Noah removed the covering from the ark and saw that the land was dry. And then on the 27th of February of Noah's 601st year, God told them to exit the ark. So over a year, living in this box, elbow to elbow with your family, with no internet, and nothing to do but feed the animals. That was not a fun thing. Another question, what did they eat? What did they eat when they were on the ark? What did people eat? A lot of grain, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I was reminded of this reading through this, but at that point, humanity had been given all of the plants of the world by God. God said, I will give you every plant for food. It's not until after the flood that we are given permission to kill animals for food. That happened later. So they would not have eaten any of the animals on the ark. They would have eaten plants. There would have been a vegetarian diet at that point. So those are some stats on the ark and what that life would have been like. But the question that I think is most important here, and the question that I keep coming back to, as I mentioned last week, when I'm looking at stories that are challenging, stories that are difficult, stories that are complicated, my question and what we're mostly going to look at this morning is, where is God? Where is God in this story? We know where Noah and his family are. We know where the animals are. We know where the rest of humanity is. So where is God in this story? And there are two places that I identify where God is in this story. And the first one is that God is on his throne. God is on his sovereign throne looking down at the earth. Scripture writers talk about God as being the Lord. The Lord. This is a word that defines God as being in charge. He is someone who possesses authority. He demands respect. He requires a response when he speaks. It's like when we're driving down the highway and, you see those lights in your rearview mirror, those flashing lights. You have to respond. Those lights have authority, and you respond to those lights, and you do what you know is expected of you when you see those lights in your rearview mirror. God has authority. He speaks, and he expects us to respond, and he deserves our response. The setting of the story in which Noah and the flood is described, the setting in which it happens is 10 generations, just 10 generations away from the Garden of Eden. 10 generations away from the Garden of Eden. In the beginning, God created the world, and Scripture says he saw that it was good. And in this story, we see that God saw that the earth was corrupt in the sight of God and full of violence. In that Eden event, God made his first covenant with humanity, and he said, "Be fruitful, fill the earth with my image, make the earth fruitful and filled with good things." And instead, 10 generations later, God looks and does not see good. He sees that we have filled the earth, yes, but we have filled it with violence. We have filled it with corruption. That word corrupt means to take something good and twist it, to take something good and spoil it. We polluted what God had made. It's as if we took a magic marker and started drawing mustache on the Mona Lisa. We wrecked it. It's spoiled. It makes us shake our heads and say, what a waste. And that is what God saw when he looked down at the earth 10 generations from Eden. When the writer says that God saw that the earth was full of violence, that word violence means a disruption of the divinely established order of things. It means oppression of the weak by the strong, oppression of the poor by the rich. It means physical violence. It means relational violence, relational disasters and pollution that cause us, that prevent us from pursuing God's blessing, prevent us from receiving God's blessing, ruining our relationships with each other, ruining our relationships with the world. That is the violence that we're talking about. It may have been physical violence, but the violence that we're talking about here is the violence that tears apart what God had made and destroys it, destroys our relationships with each other and with him. Just a few generations back, just 10 generations back, God had made a covenant with us in Eden. He had given us the earth for food and shelter and comfort. He gave us the earth and the animals, and they gave us to the earth and the animals so that we could care and cultivate and build relationships with the animals that God had given us. And we corrupted, twisted those relationships. We did violence to the earth. We did violence to ourselves. And that is the world that Noah was born into. When Noah was born, there was nothing that people wanted more than just rest and comfort. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 29, it says, Lamech Noah's father, named him Noah because the word Noah sounds like the Hebrew word for rest, for comfort. And Lamech's prayer for Noah was, "May this one comfort us in the labor and the toil of our hands caused by the ground that the Lord has cursed." The best that Lamech could hope for his newborn son was rest from the work. Noah was born into a people who were living in a land that was watered by the rivers that had flowed through Eden itself, but on a completely different planet. God, on his throne, in his sovereignty, looked down and saw not that it was good, but that it was corrupt. And seeing that, seeing the harm that we had done to the world, seeing the direction we were going, God, on his throne, made a sovereign decision. The second place that I see God in this story is not, sitting on his throne at a distance. But the second place I see God in this story is walking with Noah. Walking with Noah as a loving creator. In the beginning, God created us in his image. He walked with us in the garden. He gave us these gifts of sustenance and safety and companionship of our animal brothers and sisters and of each other. And 10 generations later, we have completely failed. And what is God's response? God's response, according to the text, is regret. He regrets having created man. And this is an interesting word. This is an interesting response. You would expect God to be angry. You would expect him to say, "How dare you spoil what I have made? How dare you ignore my sovereignty? How dare you defy my authority? How dare you do things so opposite to what I set you to do?" You would expect God's response to be angry, but there's no indication of that in the text. There is no anger there. There is sadness. There is regret. There is sorrow. Grief at what has been lost. Grief at what should have been, but now is not. The idea that God regretted creating humanity, the idea that God regretted the situation, does not necessarily mean that he was surprised by it. We can know that something is going to happen and then be disappointed when it happens. Any Toronto Maple Leafs fans here? You know what that's like. It doesn't mean that you're angry. It means that you are sad, you are sorrowful. You sigh and you say, "Oh, okay, it happened." The text doesn't suggest that God is angry. The text suggests that God is saddened and that he sorrows and he grieves over the situation. So his response is what we struggle with the most. His response is the thing that makes this story so difficult. His response is not to wipe out everything and just say, "Oh, forget it, that was a bad idea, I'm never doing that again." His response is to engage in an act of recreation. In the beginning, he created. At this point, he is beginning to recreate. God found a family he could invest in. He found a family that were righteous. Noah and his family were righteous. And that righteous is kind of the opposite of corrupt. Righteous means that we are in right relationship with where we are supposed to be going. We are engaging correctly with what God has given us. We are responding correctly to his commands, and we are living his values in the world. That righteous family was faithful to God. They were faithful to each other, faithful in their community. They were whole. They had healthy characters. They lived in accordance with God's principles, especially Noah. And God chose this family to start again. There are a lot of numbers in this story. Some of the numbers are just numbers. Some of them are meaningful. Some of them carry significance for what's happening in the story. Some of them are being used by God or by the writer to point us towards a particular idea and to reinforce what is happening and why. And two numbers that I want to look at in particular are 7 and 40. The number 7 represents in Scripture the idea of completeness, of perfection. On the seventh day, creation was completed and God rested. In Psalm 12, verse 6, the writer writes, "The words of the Lord are flawless, like silver refined in a furnace, like gold purified 7 times." That's as good as it gets. It's as pure as it is possible for it to be, because it has been purified 7 times. There are 7 pairs each of clean animals. Noah 3 times waits 7 days. He waits for 7 days and then. He waits for 7 days and then. He waits for 7 days and then. At the end of the 7 days, the waiting is complete. The time is complete. The work is finished. And he moves forward into what is next. That 7 implies completeness. The number 40 turns up a couple of times. Number 40, when it appears in Scripture, very often appears in connection with turning points, major plot developments in God's story for us in the world and our journey with him. 40 days Jesus was tested in the wilderness, and then he began his ministry. 40 years Israel wandered in the wilderness, and then they entered the promised land. The number 40 suggests that this is a time of testing. This is a time of formation. This is a time when God is putting the pieces together in his time until it's time for the next chapter. 40 suggests that God is doing something new and he's moving the story forward. The ark rose on the waters for 40 days, and for 40 days it slowly left behind the old world until it stopped rising. And then it was the beginning of the end. For 40 days, Noah's family sat in the ark, still on top of the mountain, waiting for God to tell them to open the doors. And then when God told them to open the doors, letting in the new world, that was the beginning of the beginning. And God's act of recreation had taken hold, and we were in the new time. God's act of recreation had begun. Another theme that connects Noah's story with the flood, with creation in the first place, is the idea of breath and wind. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, it says that the breath of God, the Spirit of God, hovered over the face of the deep before his creation had begun. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, God gives the breath of life to Adam and Eve. In Genesis chapter 7, 22, breath is taken from all life on earth. And then in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, God sends a breath to blow over the waters that covered the poor, beleaguered, cursed earth, to start bringing it back to life, to start bringing life back to the earth, to start doing what God alone can do, moving our story towards redemption, towards new life, giving us and giving our world what only he can give, giving us the breath of the Spirit of life. This act, God's work through the flood and through Noah's family, was an act of recreation, giving us another chance, giving us a second opportunity to obey his sovereignty and to walk alongside him in the world. So we come back to the question of parable or event. And I would suggest to you that in the end, for us as we live our lives today, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me when I get out of bed in the morning whether Noah and the flood was a parable or whether it was an event. As I said, personally, I lean towards event. I think it actually happened. But regardless of whether it was an event or a parable, it's in our scripture. It has authority. It's there for a reason. It speaks to us in a very real, meaningful way. If, for example, we interpret Noah's flood as being a parable, it still has authority for us. It still speaks truth to us in a very real way. And it's interesting that in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus is talking about his second coming, talking about his return to earth in ultimate power, when that ultimate act of recreation happens and our broken earth is made new and we begin our new lives in the new heaven and the new earth, Jesus is talking about this end of this era and the beginning of the new ultimate perfect creation. He's talking about his second coming. And Jesus says this, "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they were oblivious until the flood came and swept them all away. So will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day on which your Lord will come." Jesus is teaching from this story in the way that we see him teach from parables. He's picking out one particular theme, one core truth, and he's using it to reveal that mystery to the people he's teaching. And what is he telling them? He's telling them, you can't know what's going to happen. So pay attention to your everyday life. Pay attention to the way you live your life and live your life the way I want you to live your life. Be righteous. Be like Noah. If you interpret Noah's story as an event, if you understand it to be a story that happened to people on this planet, it's included in Scripture because it's part of our story. It's part of my story. It's part of our history and our relationship with the world and our relationship with God. It's a reminder to us of a few things. One is that our relationship, our future, our destiny is inextricable from that of our world, our planet, the plants and the animals and the earth. We are part of this whole great creation. And our relationships with each other and our relationships with God are connected. Throughout history, God made covenants with a number of people. He made covenants with Adam and Eve, with Abraham, with David, with Moses. Jesus made a covenant with us, promising what he was going to do in us and for us and through us in the world. Noah's covenant with God is a little bit different. I found this really interesting. Genesis chapter 9, verse 8. God said to Noah and his sons with him, "Behold, I now establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you." God is establishing a covenant with the birds, with the livestock, with every beast of the earth, with every living thing that came out of the ark. I establish my covenant that never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. God is making a covenant not just with Noah, not just with his family. God is making a covenant with all of the creations, with all of the animals in creation, with the world. That our shared destiny We'll never again go down that path. That God has another plan. He has a different plan, and it involves us, and it involves creation, it involves animals, it involves our world. God's covenant is with the world. We have been created by, we share the universe with, we are accountable to a God who loves us enough to make us better. A God who loves us enough to teach us, to refine us, to bring us through the crises of our lives closer to him, and who has made a promise to us and to every living creature that our story will be completed, that our story will come to its true and best ending. In Romans chapter 8, Paul writes these words: "The creation waits in eager expectation for the revelation of the sons of God." That's us. "For the creation was subjected to futility, not by its own will, but because of the one, the sovereign one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. And we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth." Noah's story, the event of the story of Noah and the flood, is a chapter in our story. It's a chapter in the story of our world, the story that God is guiding and writing, and that he will complete.